And that is the record numbers of people who arrived here in the United Kingdom last year. Net migration now stands at a staggering 606,000, with the government saying arrivals from Ukraine and Hong Kong are partially to blame. Following the release of the figures, Labour's Shadow Home Secretary clashed with the Immigration Minister this morning.
Where is the Home Secretary, who is in charge of these policies? She's gone to ground. There are reports she's not even going to do media. She's not come to this House. She's in internal meetings, presumably more private courses arranged by the civil servants. What is the point of her? Net migration should come down.
The government remains committed to reducing overall net migration to sustainable levels. That is a solemn promise we made to the British public in our manifesto, and we are unwavering in our determination to deliver it. The public rightly expect us to control our borders, whether that is stopping the boats and addressing illegal migration, or whether it's ensuring levels of legal migration do not place undue pressure on public services, on housing supply or integration.
Joining me in the studio now, TalkTV's Political Editor Kate McCann and immigration barrister Dr S Chelvan. Thank you for coming, both of you. Let's start with you, Kate. I mean, this is pretty vituperative, isn't it? What is she for? I mean, if that were in a pub environment or a work environment, for most of us, I think we'd find that to be incredibly hostile and aggressive, wouldn't we? What is she for? How rude, apart from anything else. What do you think is the basis for that level of hostility?
I think for Labour trying to respond to these figures today is actually quite difficult, because there have been a number of interviews already with Yvette Cooper and Stephen Kinnock talking about their immigration policy, and Labour doesn't want to put a number on what they think should be the right amount of net migration into the UK. They just don't want to go there. And when you're not going to put a number on it, it's very difficult to then criticise the government's numbers, because the government's comeback is, well, then tell me what you're going to do. Now, Labour have actually got some quite interesting policies in this area. One of them is around people who come here to work. They should be paid the same as UK nationals, for example. And you'll find some Conservatives, I've met a couple this week, who say that their own party, the Tory party, could do with adopting that one. But for Labour, immigration is always going to be one of those issues, a little bit like the economy, where voters look at the party and wonder whether they're really going to be tough enough. So what Labour wants you to hear from them is really tough rhetoric. But at the moment, we're not necessarily getting, in terms of the numbers at least, anything to back it up.
Just explain to people why there's outrage about these numbers when these are the legal immigrants, not the illegal immigrants. They're nothing to do with stop the boats. These are people who can come legitimately to this country. So why have we used the word blame? Why have we said it's Ukraine and Hong Kong that are to blame? Why are we blaming anybody?
Well, it's a really good question. And actually, when you look at the way that people in this country feel about immigration, it's not a simple picture. It's not as straightforward as saying that everybody in the UK hates immigration numbers. They want to see them reduced. Actually, the polling shows that since 2016, people's attitude to immigration, to people coming here and making a life here, has softened quite considerably. Yes. People now say, actually, immigration can be a really good thing. What they don't like, though, is the idea that people are somehow skipping a queue. And we can come back to whether or not that happens in reality. That is not really what happens. But what I mean by that is people arriving here in small boats on the back of lorries. And actually, in these figures, asylum seekers have been included for the first time. They make up 8% of those numbers this time round, compared to study visas, for example, at 39% and work visas at 25%. So you can see where we stand in terms of who is making up people who are arriving here in the UK. I think the difficulty for politicians is that they want to be seen to be talking about control, but control doesn't necessarily mean to everybody reducing the numbers. It means making the right choices. And when you speak to people around the country, you will hear them say, well, yes, Ukrainians should come. People from Hong Kong, yes, that's fine. Afghanistan, people,
yes.
that seems okay to me. And then you might hear, well, you know, we need people to work in fruit picking, or we need people to work in the fisheries industry. In fact, the government has been promoting that as a good idea to add fishermen or fisherwomen to the shortage occupation list today, so that those industries can compete and continue. It's a really complicated picture, because people actually want those jobs to be done. They don't want to see businesses go out of work. But that adds to these numbers, and it means you're going to have to accept that people are going to arrive here to do jobs in the UK. Lots of people would look at that and say, well, it means people want to make a life here. It means this country is good. But beneath that, there is more complexity around poverty, around services, around the NHS, around schools and roads and housing particularly. and around the skill level in this country and whether or not the government is doing enough to bring people's skills up so they can do some of these jobs.
Dr Chelvan, what's your perspective on this? Because I've used the word blame in my introduction. Who's to blame for this? We've had Yvette Cooper really spitting vitriol at Suella Braverman. What is she for? What is the point of her? The figure 606,000. Does that seem unduly high to you? Does that seem perturbing to you, disturbing to you? Or does it seem as if these are people whose workforce we badly need? We hear of the NHS severely depleted, and we hear of many other industries that need people to work in them.
Well, the headline here is that we actually need more immigration than less immigration. So you read the report itself, and it shows the patterns we're seeing at the moment is that we're going to see a slowing down of immigration and a rising amount of emigration. So what the government should be doing is making sure that less people leave the country. That's the issue in relation to people leaving the country because they've lost confidence in this government and confidence in the country. We can also see that we need more immigrants because you look at the shortage occupation list. We need vets, we need architects, we need civil engineers, we need care homes. You know, my mother's in a care home in Northumberland with Alzheimer's and dementia, and she very much relies on the care home staff to support her. So actually the message we should be getting is that we need more immigration and we've got to stop people leaving the country.
So why is the response to the figures today, the throwing up of hands, the general kind of wringing of hands and lamenting, oh my gosh, 606,000, higher than ever before. This is a parlous and dreadful state of affairs about which we all ought to be enormously concerned and incredibly worried.
Well, that's all to do with political point scoring. Once again, you read the report and actually says that whilst there's an increase from the year end of December 2022, when you compare the results to the end of the year end of June 2022, there is no real difference. So the point being is that today's data, which is experimental, it is provisional, shows that we don't really have to worry. It's political point scoring.
OK, so if it's political point scoring, what should happen next? When you say people should be, prohibited or discouraged, I suppose is the best you can get from emigrating and persuaded to immigrate, when actually the rhetoric is entirely different. How are you supposed to swing it round to change it?
Well, I think the point we need now is lots of our industries, and Kate was looking at the NHS. We've got lots of industries. You've got a list of nearly 30 shortage occupation lists. Is that we should be encouraging more people to come to the UK because what really is to blame is Brexit. We haven't mentioned that term yet. Brexit is to blame because the thousands of EU nationals which have left the country and continue to leave. 36% of those who left the country last year were EU nationals because they've lost confidence because of the hostile environment our politicians have created by having their headlines, such as today, saying that there's too much immigration. When you actually look at the detail and you address the experts, what they're saying in the reports is that we've actually got to be worried about not keeping people in and requiring more people to come into the country to...
Kate, it's so difficult because, you've had this delightful guest, incredibly plausible, very convincing, charming, elegantly attired, telling me that, this is all the fault of Brexit and Brexit's responsible and what we really need is to persuade more people to come and discourage people from leaving. And yet all of the discourse in Westminster seems to be absolutely headed in the opposite direction, doesn't it?
Well, not all of it. There
Almost.
are some...
Who
the majority, you're right.
Who's arguing in favour of more
there's a really good example.
migration?
An Conservative MP called Alicia Cairns today, who said, well, look at these figures. What it shows is that this is an attractive country to come to. We are attracting very talented and skilled people to come and work here. And actually, we should be talking about how generous we are as a country. Some of the numbers of people we've welcomed over the last year have been huge. I think the difficulty with the point about Brexit is that when we had open borders to European Union nationals, the government had no control over who came here, what skill level they had, all of that kind of stuff. What they would say about this particular system is that they have the option to allow people who are skilled in certain industries on the shortage occupation list to arrive in the UK to fill those particular roles. Now, when you talk about control, that doesn't necessarily mean reducing the numbers, and that's the problem that the government is currently coming up against, because what they're finding, and there's this real tension within the government itself in the Cabinet between the Home Office and the Treasury wants to grow the economy. They can see the quickest and easiest way to do that is to open up to those skilled workers and get things moving. But the Home Office wants to be able to meet its own target of reducing net migration, and to do that, it means closing off those levers. Skilling up British workers and helping them to fill those roles takes quite a long time. And with the economy where it is right now and inflation where it is, The government doesn't have that time to do it. So it's a really difficult political equation, but I do think attitudes towards this issue in the country are not as simple as perhaps the arguments that play out in Parliament.
And the steps which have been announced by Suella Braverman this week in relation to stopping students being able to come into the country with their families is going to have a devastating impact on our education sector, which requires funding, because it's not getting it through further government funding. And what is the message we're giving to the country, to people who come from various communities and who, £42 billion a year, migrants. I'm an immigrant myself. I wasn't born in this country. I actually piggybacked my mother's visa to come here in the late 70s. So it's not a bad thing in relation to migrating to the UK to enrich our society.
But tell me about the infrastructure here. Tell me about people saying this country is full. It's full. Our schools are full, our hospitals are full. You've got to wait. I was reading something the other day where somebody said in our citizen conurbations, if you want to put your child on a swing in the park, you've got to wait for the swing to become vacant because there are so many children in every park trying to swing on the swing. And actually, I have experienced that. It's not a joke. It's not an urban myth. It is true. So you can't get a dentist. You can't get an NHS dentist for love of money. You can't get an appointment to see your GP, or if you can, it's only excellent if you're ill in about 3 weeks' time. Then it works out really, really well. People are very worried indeed about getting their children into schools, the good ones that are near them. People are worried about
let's start with the facts.
All manner of things, including the sewers, whether they're adequate for the sheer number of people now inhabiting the country. So are you saying that all those people concerned about all those things, about whether the structure can hold, to paraphrase Yeats, one of your favourites, do you think that they are wrong to be concerned? Are you saying there's ample everything and let them all come and let more people come because we have the means to support and look after them?
Look, the majority of the migrants are actually coming here into the country having to pay the NHS surcharge in relation to the NHS. So that's a fact. I'm a Tamil myself. 1 in 10 doctors in the NHS are Tamils. The NHS would crumble if it wasn't for immigrants, and we still need more migrants in. The issues about swings and roundabouts, I mean, the point is we're living in 2023. The majority of children staying at home with their Nintendo rather than going swings and roundabouts. But the urgent message is, don't blame migrants, blame politicians.
For what?
For their decision-making, for squandering the money, for Brexit, for the issues regarding fast-track,
didn't we vote for Brexit? Billions. How can we blame politicians for our voting for Brexit?
Well, it's not my message. It's Farage who says Brexit has failed. It's not my message.
Yeah, but that's a one-liner to get him wherever he wants to go at the moment, isn't it? That's not something he sincerely and implicitly believes. Over to Kate.
Before I reply.
I see what you did there. Yeah,
I don't think we take that as a kosher protestation of his real thoughts, do we?
But this is where this argument meets with reality, because how people experience immigration, or how people perceive that they experience immigration in their area, or how they perceive public services, can end up getting linked to this question. Actually, it's much more complex. The NHS has huge waiting lists. We need more staff. Where are those staff currently coming from? They're not coming from this country in the main. They're coming from abroad, particularly into social care. It's on the shortage occupation list. Huge numbers of people come here to support that service. You can't have one argument without the other. The reality is the NHS is in a very difficult position. All political parties agree with that. There are lots of different plans of how to solve it, and some of them involve the workforce. But when you take all of this back to the beginning, there is something there about skilling and educating people who live in this country, who want to work in this country, who are maybe economically inactive right now, who could be helped into certain positions. But I was here with you last week when we spoke to the fruit farmer in the north. He was in Angus.
It's completely impossible.
But he said, the thing that's really stuck with me from that conversation, he said, I need 4,000 workers to pick fruit over 6 months, the period he can grow strawberries. He said, there are 4,000 people out of work in my area and I'm only one fruit farm. I can't take all of those people because they can't do the physical labour.
And also it's only half a year's employment and they couldn't survive on the money.
So it's not a simple equation, and it's very different in big cities like London to how it is in Angus, in a fruit sort of picking. It's very complicated, but I think that the message here is that, yes, these are record numbers, but these are political choices. This is not willy-nilly. The UK now has control. The government has made political choices, and ultimately it's having to answer to them.
Well, thank you both very much indeed for coming.